Chapter 71. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The three panel makers were eager to impress the king and crown prince, so they each took a stone slab and got to work. All three were experts, and lithographic printing proved to be as convenient and simple as they had hoped. They all nailed it on the first try. The most senior craftsman, after watching the dried ink peel off the slate, suggested, "Your Highness, the base ink might work better if it was a bit thicker." Joseph nodded. "You guys will need to fine-tune the viscosity." He had a basic grasp of the process, but the details were up to them to perfect. The craftsman immediately began brainstorming. "Maybe add some asphalt. Yeah, we could also try resin." "Your Highness, I have another question." A middle-aged craftsman spoke up. "Stone plate printing is pretty different from copper plates. The pressure and angles are all off. I doubt our existing printing presses can be used directly." Oh. Joseph was taken aback. He hadn't even considered the printing press. He looked at the craftsman. "Can you modify it?" The craftsman shook his head, just as Joseph began to wonder if he needed to find a workshop specializing in printing press manufacturing. A shy, but confident voice piped up. "Maybe I can help with this." Joseph turned to see Louis XVI looking at him eagerly. His eyes lit up. This man was a top mechanical craftsman, whose lock-making assistants were famous masters. Modifying a printing press would be a piece of cake for them. He immediately bowed and said with a smile, "You've saved the day for lithographic printing. I think we should call this new printing press the King's Printing Press." Later, seeing the royal workshop swamped, Joseph retreated to the palace to start planning what to publish. He summoned his scribe, gave him a brief outline, and asked him to write a novel based on it. The clerk followed orders, but didn't deliver the manuscript until that evening. Joseph read it and was speechless. The sentences were fine, but the characters were flat and lifeless. He sighed. "This guy's good at formal documents, not novels." It seemed he needed professional writers. He asked Emin to find some writers ASAP. Emin was efficient. The next morning, as soon as Joseph finished breakfast, for writers of various ages and appearances stood before him. Of course, it helped that these writers already lived at Versailles. They all bowed, and Emin introduced them one by one. "Your Highness, this is the Count de Beaumarchais, a famous writer in Paris." Joseph was surprised. "Beaumarchais? As in, The Marriage of Figaro?" The gray-haired man with thick glasses bowed slightly. "I'm honored Your Highness has read my play." Joseph was flabbergasted. He just wanted some hired guns, and Emin had landed him a literary giant. He quickly praised the great writer. Emin continued, "This is Viscount St. Pierre, and this is Bar." Every single one of them was a major player in the French literary scene. Joseph was overwhelmed. Since they were already here, why not get some famous writers involved? He looked at the four masters and smiled. "I need help writing the story I've come up with into a novel. You keep the manuscript fees, and I'll pay 2 livres for every 500 words. How does that sound?" Whatever the writers thought, they had to humor the crown prince, so they bowed and nodded. "It's an honor to serve Your Highness." They were all curious how many stories the crown prince had in mind that he needed 4 writers for. Joseph didn't waste any time. He led them to the study, sorted through his favorite stories from his past life, picked a few, and started assigning tasks. "Viscount St. Pierre, you'll be writing about a man named..." Joseph almost said the familiar name, but, remembering to adapt it to French tastes, he changed it. "The story of a boy named Hunter Shao." St. Pierre recorded this with interest, not expecting the 13-year-old crown prince to come up with anything amazing. Joseph continued, "Hunter Shao was born into a family of alchemists. He possessed incredible alchemical talent, far surpassing his peers. But when he turned 12, he put on a ring, and everything changed. His alchemy skills started to decline. 3 years later, he barely scored alchemy level 3 in his test. His family began to mock and shun him." St. Pierre said, "That's awful. What's wrong with that ring?" "We'll get to that." Joseph glossed over and continued, "The worst part is, one day, his fiancée, Elizabeth, a talented girl from the Alchemy Knights, came to his family and broke off their engagement in front of everyone. She felt his talent was too poor and that he wasn't worthy of her. Hunter Shao, deeply humiliated, argued back. To avoid breaking off the engagement and damaging her family's reputation, Elizabeth proposed an alchemy competition in 3 years. If he lost, the engagement would be off. Hunter Shao accepted the challenge and vowed, 30 years ago, I was down on my luck, 30 years from now, you'll regret you messed with me. After the breakup fiasco ended, Hunter Shao discovered the secret of his ring. Saint Pierre was hooked. Your Highness, what happened next? Joseph smiled. Write this up first, and I'll tell you the rest of the story. Saint Pierre nodded reluctantly. Your Highness, it's a fantastic story. I'll do my best to do it justice. Oh, by the way, what's the name of the novel? Joseph thought for a moment. Let's call it Refining the Sky. Viscount Bar, after Saint Pierre left, immediately stepped forward, hoping to hear an equally compelling story. Joseph said, You're going to write a story about a woman. Her name is Cress. One morning, she woke up with a headache. She found herself lying at her desk with a note in front of her, Everyone will die, including me. Chapter 72 Shameless, please vote. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph said in a deep voice, then she saw the gun, surrounded by blood. In the mirror, she saw this gruesome head wound, the edges burned. Obviously, she'd been shot. Bar's eyes widened. Holy crap. She's alive. Yeah, Joseph replied. Plus, she discovered she has some kind of power, that she can float in this endless gray mist. That's wild. What's the title of this book? It's called, The Lord of Girlfriends. After Bar left, Joseph turned to the next writer. I need you to write a story about a nobleman imprisoned in the Bastille for being mentally ill. This young guy's name is Phil Lee. He claims that when he closes his eyes, he enters a magical world. There's this evil wizard who's kidnapping deformed or sick kids, using them to brew immortality potions. Phil Lee gets snatched too. Joseph turned to Beaumarchais, the most celebrated writer in France, who was starting to get antsy. Okay, Your Highness, what's my story? Joseph immediately thought of Tian Haitian, his favorite author from his past life. All his books were instant hits, and he was practically a shoo-in for the Nobel Prize. Plus, the guy was super handsome. Joseph knew Tian Haitian's work inside and out. He blurted out, this one's called, Lady, Please Stop. The day flew by. By dusk, Joseph had 4 manuscripts. Beaumarchais and the others were indeed top-tier writers. Their novels were incredibly vivid, full of character and intricate plots. You could taste their individual styles in every line, like a fine wine. However, each person had only submitted 4 pages, maybe 2,000 words. He had to gently suggest they write a little more each day. They exchanged glances. Because the stories were so addictive, they were completely engrossed, even skipping lunch. This was already more than double their usual output. And the Crown Prince thought it was too little. After they left, they called in their students and writer buddies to help out, not just to boost their royalties. These guys weren't hurting for cash, they just wanted to write faster so they could hear the next part of the story from Joseph ASAP. Joseph, meanwhile, sent someone to rush the manuscripts to Denik at the Paris business newspaper, telling him to get them printed immediately. The next morning, Denik hurried to the palace of Versailles with a magazine proof, to show Joseph the first publication after the revisions. Joseph quickly flipped through the 2 newspapers. Paris Business still focused on freedom and ideals, covering market trends and business insights. The whole second page was now dedicated to a novel called Refining the Sky. The 3rd page explained the new tax bill, the newly launched news and pictures. The publishing license had been approved at noon, Crown Prince style. Normally it took at least 2 months. News and pictures was less subtle. The front page headline screamed, investigating the real reasons behind the new tax bill's repeated failures. Page 2 featured the Lord of Girlfriends. The rest of the paper was mostly about the tax bill, with some recent French news sprinkled in. Since lithographic printing wasn't ready yet, they included some pre-engraved landscape paintings of Paris. Later, there would be tons of news illustrations, but no photos yet, so they'd have to hire artists. Joseph was impressed with Dennick's work. He was a pro, coming from a newspaper family. With these two newspapers in the hands of Parisians, the aristocracy wouldn't have a stranglehold on public opinion anymore. Dennick, seeing the Crown Prince had reviewed the proof, immediately said, "Your Highness, as you instructed, the monthly subscription price for both newspapers is 3 livres. I feel obligated to inform you that at this price we will be operating at a significant loss. Most daily newspapers cost 6 to 8 livres a month, and weekly newspapers cost between 1 livre, 10 sous, and 2 livres. Paris Business and News and Pictures were dailies, so 3 livres was definitely a money loser." Joseph nodded calmly. "That's fine. Just sell them at that price. Once the lithographic printing is up and running, the cost should drop below 3 livres a month." Honestly, he didn't care if he lost a little money. Once the newspaper's circulation took off, he could easily make it up with advertising revenue. Seeing Joseph's determination, Dennick reluctantly moved on. "Your Highness, I've recruited over 40 of those newsboys you mentioned." He hesitated, then said carefully, "I'm not sure how many people will be willing to buy newspapers on the streets of Paris." The newsboy concept was Joseph's idea for a new way to sell newspapers. Back then, newspapers in Europe were mostly subscription-based, delivered by paper delivery boys. The idea of a newsboy like you'd see later hadn't caught on yet. One reason retail sales were low was the high price of newspapers. They cost 4 to 6 sous on average. The average craftsman only earned 5 to 10 sous a day. Few people would buy a paper on a whim. Joseph had slashed the price to 2 sous, and planned to drop it to 1, or even less. At that price, a lot more people could afford it. Joseph knew that street retail was the perfect way to sell newspapers. Newsboys could shout out the headlines, and people who were interested could easily buy a copy. Plus, they could sell other stuff to help offset the newspaper's cost. As for child labor, it wasn't really a thing back then. Kids as young as 7 or 8 worked in factories all over Europe. They were important breadwinners for their families. Selling newspapers was an easy, relatively high-paying job, so it would probably be pretty popular. After giving Dennick some more instructions, Joseph dismissed the newspaper manager, who headed back to Paris. What they didn't know was that the two newspapers were already causing a stir. In the streets of Paris, kids were shouting, waving newspapers, "Read all about it. 2 sous a copy." The newspaper features the latest novel. An alchemy student breaks off his engagement. Can he get revenge in 3 years? One guy who had just gotten paid the day before bought a newspaper on a whim. He was immediately hooked by the awesome story on page 2. He was so engrossed that he walked straight into a tree and realized he'd gone the wrong way. Shout out to Rablish and book friends 202303011015218000 for their generous donations. The author is deeply grateful. Chapter 73, Using Newspaper as a Sword. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Newspapers were flying off the stands all over Paris. Most newsboys flocked to the Paris Merchant newspaper office, hoping for a break, since decent work was hard to come by. To everyone's surprise, sales were through the roof. They made 6 deniers for every 10 papers sold. By noon, a lucky kid could hawk 50 newspapers, making more than he would in a whole day at a workshop. Hunter Zhao's broken engagement and Cress's miraculous survival after being shot were the talk of the town before lunchtime. People couldn't help but eavesdrop, itching to know what all the excitement was about. Just as they were wondering if they should shell out for a subscription, they heard a newsboy shouting outside and rushed to grab a copy. The trendiest lady started hosting salons, debating immortal Cress and the alchemic family. They knew these stories were about to explode, and they wanted to be ahead of the curve. By evening, "Have you read that novel?" was the new Parisian greeting. No wonder entertainment was so dull in the 18th century. There were only a handful of plays and novels, and most people were bored stiff of them. Scandalous rumors about the nobility were the only way to pass the time. For readers of this era, these fresh, innovative stories were absolutely mind-blowing. One chapter, and you were hooked. That's no exaggeration. Even in the 21st century, there have been cases of American guys getting so absorbed in porn that they kicked their drug habits to the curb. For Parisians starved for entertainment, these novels were pure excitement, packed with twists, turns, and cliffhangers that kept them glued to the page. The next day, just as everyone was dissecting yesterday's plot, they were stunned to find a brand new chapter in the morning paper. It peeled back some mysteries while dangling even more tantalizing questions. The story was still gripping. Who could resist? Forget food, gotta buy that paper. Some people were literally fighting over the last copy in the newsboy's hand. By 3 p.m., both Paris Handelsblatt and La Presse et Bild were completely sold out. Denik stared at the dozens of newsboys anxiously waiting to collect their papers, feeling like he was dreaming. He knew the Crown Prince's amazing story would boost sales, but he never imagined they'd be this insane. Good heavens. They printed 7,000 copies of each paper, and every single one was gone. Keep in mind, Paris only had around 500,000 residents, and the top-selling Paris News barely cracked 3,000 copies. These two papers combined were outselling Paris News by a factor of 5. His hands started shaking. He sprinted into the printing shop, pointed at the press, and yelled at the workers. More. We need another 1,000 copies, ASAP. Just then, a manager from the newspaper office came rushing over, practically vibrating with excitement. Mr. Denik. The Origin of Elegance perfume shop, Auditor Iron Tools, and, well, a bunch of big-name businesses are here, wanting to talk about advertising. Denik waved his hand dismissively. Tell them to wait. I'll deal with it after I get the printing sorted out. He could afford to be cocky. With over 14,000 newspapers flying off the shelves, advertisers would be lining up at his door. Thanks to the Paris merchant's newfound popularity, readers weren't just devouring the novel, they were actually reading the article about the tax bill too. On the streets, conversations about the bill were popping up everywhere. If you ask me, those fancy nobles should be paying more taxes. Exactly. The article says the increases mostly hit us regular folks. Why are we paying more than the lords and ladies? City Hall always cries poverty. Why not squeeze the nobles for a change? Humph, the High Court keeps blocking the tax bills, because the judges are all nobles themselves. So that's why they're always defending the court's power. It's the power to dodge taxes. You got it. The Duke of Orleans had managed to sway public opinion on the bill overnight, thanks to the power of the Paris newspapers, but Joseph wasn't even going full throttle in this PR battle. He still had 2 novel manuscripts waiting in the wings, earmarked for pamphlets. He wasn't just going to rely on newspapers. That would be a waste. Since a fight had started, it was time to ditch the gentlemanly behavior. Sure, pamphlets were cheap, rumor-mongering rags, and relied on sensationalism to grab attention, but they reached a huge audience. Over 60% of French people could read. Plenty of folks couldn't afford newspapers, so they turned to pamphlets for entertainment. Pamphlets owned the bottom of the market. Joseph wasn't about to ignore that. Pamphlet readers weren't likely to buy them consistently, which was bad for serialized novels. So, he decided to release a weekly pamphlet containing 7 days' worth of chapters. When tens of thousands of these pamphlets hit the streets, that's when he'd really launch his all-out attack. At a formal ball at the Palace of Versailles, a gaggle of aristocratic ladies gave Princess Therese resentful glares, grumbling about how she always monopolized the Crown Prince's attention. The young men shot Joseph helpless looks, hoping some kind soul would kidnap the Crown Prince so they could get a chance with the princess. Of course, Joseph was using his sister as a shield. He had a serious aversion to dancing. After a few days of getting used to the rumors, Therese had become much less concerned about them. She was chatting with Joseph. I've heard that Crown Prince's blessing you invented is some miracle cure. I've been taking it, but it hasn't done anything yet. Joseph asked, concerned, where do you feel bad? Do you have a fever? Therese shook her head. No fever. Just dizzy, no energy, short of breath. I fainted a few months back. Doctors can't figure it out. Dr. Baptiste suggested I go to Chateau Mouton to rest up. Joseph frowned. This wasn't a symptom of taking salicin. What kind of stuff was she taking? You can't just take any medicine you hear about. You have to follow your doctor's orders. Therese nodded earnestly. That's what Dr. Baptiste told me to take. Joseph held his head. What other medications are you taking? Therese listed a few herbs. Joseph looked at her pale face and thought, these symptoms sound like severe anemia. Girls her age are prone to it. Is it iron deficiency, or something else? Therese added, besides taking medicine, I also get bloodletting treatments every 2 weeks. Joseph's face went dark. You need to fire your doctor. Chapter 70 For the King is the Best Craftsman. You are listening at novelfull.audio. My sister's got the constitution of an ox. Joseph was blown away. He was anemic, needed blood transfusions twice a month, and he was still kicking. Therese looked confused. Why? What did Mr. Baptiste do wrong? He didn't do anything right. Then it hit Joseph, Dr. Lamarck's news from a few days ago about successfully extracting tocopherol. He felt a surge of excitement. He'd originally planned to use vitamin E, tocopherol, for cosmetics. But it seemed to have a real effect on pathological anemia and could boost immunity, perfect for Therese. Add some iron supplements, and her anemia should improve dramatically. He could ask Dr. Lamarck to synthesize some ferrous sulfate for the iron, easy peasy to make, just heat iron with dilute sulfuric acid, then precipitate and filter it. He gave Therese a serious look. No more bleeding, ever. It's terrible for you. Also, I've cooked up something that should help. I'll get it to you tomorrow. Really? You actually have a potion? Therese was surprised. Truth was, she was done with bleeding. No girl wants a bunch of scars on her arms. Joseph nodded. Oh, Joseph, you're such a genius. Suddenly, Therese felt lightheaded. She quickly said her goodbyes, grabbed a maid for support, and headed back to her room to rest. Joseph was calculating dosages of vitamin E and ferrous sulfate when it struck him, why not sell this stuff as a health product at the Paris Angel store? Vitamin E helps with anti-aging and regulating periods. Combined with ferrous sulfate to build blood, it's the ultimate girl's best friend. Women would go nuts for it. He thought of that one popular liquid tonic from back in the day, a gleam in his eye. Let's call it, Guyfile Oral Elixir. The social climbers nearby, practically drooling, couldn't contain themselves any longer. As soon as the princess left, they swarmed the crown prince, vying for his attention with flirty poses and shy glances. Joseph, already with a headache, was about to call for Perna's help when a woman in her 30s approached with wine and snacks. He grabbed a glass. The woman seized the opportunity, curtsying with a smile. Your Highness, may I have a moment of your time? Darimon whispered a quick reminder. Your Highness, this is Mrs. Eric. Joseph realized she wasn't a maid, so he bowed in return. What can I do for you? The younger women, seeing that the older broad had jumped in so fast, shot her daggers. Mrs. Eric ignored them, turning to Joseph. Your Highness, my late husband had a business partner who greatly admired you. She handed him an envelope. It's a bit forward, but he'd like to discuss something with you. Of course, it's entirely your decision whether to meet him. But he also said you won't regret it. Joseph opened the envelope. Inside was a theater ticket. Mrs. Eric leaned in, whispering. Your Highness, this is from Mr. Hartley, the British ambassador. British ambassador? Joseph's eyes narrowed. What did he want? He recalled Dupont's mention of the Eden Treaty between Britain and France. Figured, no matter what the British were up to, getting a feel for their angle couldn't hurt, so, he held up the envelope and smiled at Mrs. Eric. Please tell him I'll be there. Finally, after what felt like forever, the ball ended. Exhausted, Joseph returned to the palace and found the king's attendants waiting at his door. Your Royal Highness, the attendant bowed, His Majesty the King invites you to his workshop. He says he has a surprise for you. Joseph followed him to the workshop. Before he could even greet Louis XVI, the king happily dragged him over to a black iron machine, a printing press. Louis XVI gestured to the craftsman nearby, who nodded and placed a painted slate in the middle of the press. He grabbed some paper, put it on the iron frame, applied ink, pulled the lever hard, and pressed it down. Lifting the lever, the paper now had a landscape painting of the Palace of Versailles. The craftsman kept going, pulling the lever again, and another painting appeared. He printed 5 in a row before stopping to reapply ink and add paper. The whole thing took just over a minute. Louis XVI beamed at Joseph, clearly expecting a standing ovation. "Dear father, you finished converting the lithographic press so quickly?" Joseph exclaimed, "Just 3 days." The craftsman, sensing the crown prince's lack of awareness, quickly clarified. "Actually, your majesty invented the automatic feeder." He pointed to a rake-like lever on the paper stand. "Before, I had to rearrange and align the paper every time. Now I can print 5 pages at once, several times faster." Joseph stared wide-eyed at Louis XVI. The man was the patent holder for the new guillotine, after all. He really lived up to his reputation. He'd not only adapted the printing machine to the stone base, but also vastly improved it. This would seriously cut down on printing time and costs. Words fail me, other than to offer praise and admiration. Joseph bowed dramatically, hand on his chest. "You're definitely the most impressive king I've ever seen, in mechanics, anyway. He added mentally. Louis XVI rubbed his hands, beaming. "If I improve the spring, I can print 10 to 20 sheets at a time." He launched into a detailed explanation of his invention. "See here, when you pull the lever, it moves the paper and pushes it forward." Joseph, studying the intricate mechanisms, thought to himself that he could start developing the next generation of rifles now, instead of waiting for the Charleville arsenal. The king was a master craftsman, a shame not to use him. He asked about the plate-making craftsmen, learned they were already skilled at making stone plates, and immediately had Iman summon the bodyguards that had been assigned to them, ordering them to escort the craftsman back to the Paris merchant newspaper office right away. Louis XVI asked his assistant, the famous lockmaker Mr. Farrowland, to go to the newspaper office and help with the press renovation. Once the craftsmen were gone, Joseph sidled up to Louis XVI, turning on the charm. "Dear father, I have a very ingenious design for a rifle, one that only a highly skilled craftsman could make. Care to give it a shot?" Louis XVI's eyes lit up. Chapter 75 Subversive Weapons. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph gave a quick intro. "This gun uses a brand new firing system. It's got way better loading speed and power than the old flintlocks, plus it's more reliable in the rain and less likely to misfire." Louis XVI's eyes lit up. Even someone who didn't know a thing about the military could tell this new gun would be a game-changer for warfare. He knew everyone in France was calling him incompetent and saying he wasn't doing his job behind his back. He wanted to be a king his people respected, like the Sun King, but running a country takes a certain talent, and that just wasn't his strong suit. But gun making, that was his area of expertise. He knew precision machinery like the back of his hand. A lot of gunsmiths back then started as watchmakers. He was a certified master craftsman in both the locksmiths and watchmakers guilds. In the past, no matter how intricate a lock he made, nobody would really praise him for it. But guns were different. These were the backbone of the nation's military. If this new gun could help the French army crush the enemy, who would call him a useless king then? Joseph asked a guard to grab a flintlock and pointed to the firing mechanism. Right now, flintlocks use a flint striking an iron plate to make sparks. Those sparks ignite the gunpowder, which sets off the main charge and fires the bullet. Louis XVI nodded. He'd done plenty of hunting and knew the deal. Joseph removed the flint and continued. A few years back, the British cooked up something called mercury fulminate. It explodes on impact. If we fix that stuff near the back of the gun barrel, the hammer can strike the mercury fulminate and fire the gun directly. Louis XVI frowned. But how do you attach the mercury fulminate safely? It explodes on impact, so it's a hazard for soldiers to carry. One accidental fall and they could be toast. Joseph smiled slightly. That's why the British haven't managed to use mercury fulminate in their weapons yet. Louis XVI looked at him expectantly, knowing his son had probably found a solution. I call it a percussion cap. Joseph grabbed a piece of paper and tore off a small bit, folding it into a bowl shape. This is like a copper shell. He pinched off some paraffin wax and said, this is the mercury fulminate. He packed the wax into the paper bowl, tamping it down. Just like that, we have a percussion cap. The copper shell blocks outside impacts, preventing accidental explosions. Storing these in cotton-lined pouches would make them even safer for the troops. Louis XVI was surprised and asked, how do you fire the gun then? Copper's malleable. Joseph picked up a small hammer and tapped the bottom of the paper bowl. We'll make the hammer flat, so when you pull the trigger and the hammer strikes, it flattens the bottom of the cap and sets off the mercury fulminate inside. Louis XVI picked up the flintlock, thinking. So, we can ditch the priming pan. Just drill a hole in the barrel, stick the percussion cap in, pull the trigger, and boom. Joseph was impressed. He really was a master craftsman, getting it right away. He nodded. Drilling a hole would make it tough to remove the cap after firing. Better to put a hollow cylinder behind the side of the barrel. You press the cap onto the cylinder, and when it fires, the flame goes through the hollow and into the barrel. Then, it's easy to pop the cap off. Louis XVI was getting more and more excited. Loading a flintlock was a multi-step process. Gunpowder pouch, pour powder into the pan, pack it, cock the hammer, then fire. With a percussion cap, you just pull the trigger, insert the cap, and fire. That's a 2 or 3 second difference. Don't underestimate those seconds. Half a second can mean life or death in battle. A seasoned veteran might only reload 3 seconds faster than a rookie. Plus, the percussion cap gun wouldn't have the leak in the priming pan, so the gunpowder's full force would be on the bullet. The power would definitely be a big upgrade from the flintlock. He looked at Joseph, pride and affection shining in his eyes. My boy, how did you come up with something so brilliant? God must have kissed you on the head. Joseph figured, of course, he'd seen it on a military forum. He just smiled and said, thank God. He grabbed a pen and paper, sketched the caplock's design from memory, and handed it to Louis XVI. This is the general idea, but the specific measurements, parts, and manufacturing details are up to our great king to figure out. Louis XVI puffed out his chest, bursting with pride. Don't you worry. Together, father and son, will create a gun that'll shock all of Europe. After leaving the workshop, Joseph couldn't help but think. Why hadn't he thought of asking the king for help with weapon development before? In the royal workshop were the most complete, highest quality tools and instruments in France. Louis XVI and his assistants were the best around technically, and most importantly, with the king in charge, he wouldn't have to worry about technology leaks. It was a built-in secure R&D lab. Otherwise, he'd need 100 guards just to keep an eye on things and prevent industrial espionage. He started to think about how there would be more and more tech secrets to keep in the future, and the sooner he got patent law in place, the better. Once the percussion cap gun was ready, he needed to ramp up mercury processing and firearm manufacturing fast to make them in quantity. This new gun wouldn't just be a weapon, it'd be a way to exert influence over the army, so he needed to have it made in an arsenal he controlled. While Joseph was thinking, he had arrived at his bedroom. Tiredly unbuttoning his coat, he touched the envelope Mrs. Eric had given him. He pulled out the theater ticket and froze. The play was The Sphere, the very novel he had serialized in the newspaper. Then he remembered Denico saying that a theater wanted to buy the rights. Joseph hadn't paid much attention and let Denico handle it, never imagining the show would open in 4 days. The novel had only run for 3 days in total. How impatient were these theater folks? They'd had, at most, a week to write the script and rehearse. How did they pull it off? In the next few days, Joseph visited Lamarck's pharmaceutical lab and explained how to process ferrous sulfate. Then, he planned the marketing campaign for Paris Angel Company's new product, Royal Lady Elixir, and dropped by the royal workshop to see the king's progress. For days flew by. That noon, Joseph's carriage stopped on Rue Richelieu. A huge crowd was gathered outside the Comédie Française, packed to the gills. Chapter 76. Who is fooling whom? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Naturally, Joseph didn't mingle with the regular crowd. Guards escorted him directly through the VIP entrance to the theater. His seat was in a lavish box overlooking the stage on the third floor. The space was huge, easily accommodating a dozen people, but he was the only one there. As the audience streamed in and the music swelled, the stage curtain slowly rose. The set depicted a light gray castle. Inside, a blond boy in a blue coat was etching runes onto a conical glass bottle. Colorful mist swirled within the bottle. An old man in a robe examined it and said flatly, "Thank you for the elemental gift, Hunter Shao. Sadly, you've only reached the third level of alchemy." Sarcastic voices echoed around him. "Oh, am I hearing things? Our little genius is only level 3. The elements must have turned their backs on him. No progress in years. Never thought a genius could fall so far." Joseph hadn't expected the actors to be this good, aside from the over-the-top expressions. As he was engrossed in the performance, a knock sounded on the box door. Iman glanced out and whispered to Joseph, "Your Highness, it's the British ambassador." "Let him in." The door opened, and a middle-aged man with thin lips, dressed in a grey-black robe, removed his hat and bowed. "Your Royal Highness, what a pleasure to meet you here. I am David Hartley, the current British ambassador to France. I'm visiting you in a personal capacity, of course." Joseph nodded. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ambassador. Please, have a seat." Hartley took a seat at the rear of the box, positioned so he wouldn't be visible from other boxes. As an ambassador, meeting privately with the French Crown Prince was highly inappropriate and could spark a diplomatic incident if discovered. "Your Royal Highness," Hartley began with a smile, "I often hear you praised. Your talents as the son of the gods have taken the world by storm. You are known for your kindness and wisdom." After buttering him up considerably, the British ambassador continued, "Your Highness, I've always been a strong advocate for a solid, traditional friendship between Britain and France." Joseph's eyebrows rose. Britain and France, a traditional friendship? More like a history of trying to bury each other. Hartley, a seasoned politician, delivered his lies with utmost sincerity. "Unfortunately, some agitators have caused friction between our two countries in the past. A truly regrettable situation. Even now, there are still those who oppose our friendship." He glanced at Joseph, testing the waters. "Therefore, I believe we must work even harder to nurture this precious friendship. What are your thoughts?" Joseph, unsure of Hartley's angle, simply replied, "Yes, long live the friendship between Britain and France." Hartley's eyes lit up. He didn't see the 13-year-old as a cunning player at all. This prince is definitely pro-British, he thought. The intel is spot on. He talked about the bright future of British-French cooperation, then shifted the topic. "Your Highness, I've long had a proposal that benefits both our nations." Joseph feigned interest. "Oh. Do tell." Hartley straightened up. "I understand your Highness strongly opposed wasting funds on building large warships." "I couldn't agree more." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "That topic was discussed in a cabinet meeting." "How did the British get wind of that?" "He'd need to look into this leak," Hartley continued. "Some people in the UK keep pushing for building warships and squandering taxpayer money. I believe it's a waste. If we stop this arms race, the mutual threat disappears. Therefore, I suggest we push for a treaty to limit shipbuilding across countries. For example, the British launch no more than 5,000 tons of warships annually, and the French no more than 2,000 tons. Of course, British maritime trade is extensive and requires more vessels. Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries will also participate in the treaty. Joseph frowned. Did Hartley really think he was an idiot? History showed that continental European countries needed a strong navy to avoid being blockaded to death. He'd only suspended the production of sailing warships to cut costs. He hadn't expected the British to think he was giving up on challenging the Royal Navy. Seeing Hartley was still going on, Joseph interrupted. Mr. Ambassador, a shipbuilding treaty seems far off. Perhaps we should review existing treaties first. Existing? Like the Treaty of Eden. Hartley tensed. Your Highness, I believe that treaty is perfectly reasonable and complete. Nothing needs addressing. Yes, reasonable, but room for improvement remains, Joseph said with a smile. France's industrial manufacturing is weak and can't produce many necessities on its own. However, high-quality, inexpensive British goods are exactly what we need. But as you know, the Treaty of Eden's tariffs are too high, inflating prices and costing the French people a fortune. Hartley was stunned. Normally, the French desperately tried to raise tariffs to protect their industries. The prince thought they were too high. He really is pro-British, Hartley asked cautiously. What are you suggesting? Joseph said sternly, we must continue Treaty of Eden negotiations and lower tariffs further. This benefits both our countries. Hartley smiled. Can you be more specific? First, tariffs on industrial products like textiles, steel, and paper must be cut by at least half. Joseph glanced at the ambassador's reaction and added, to demonstrate equality between our countries, the United Kingdom should simultaneously reduce tariffs on French industrial products. Hartley nodded. Equality, yes, you're right. Equality must be reflected. Britain's industrial scale and technology far surpassed France's, and it wasn't afraid of French competition. Even eliminating import tariffs on British industrial goods wouldn't matter. Seeing Hartley barely containing his excitement, Joseph knew he could seal the deal. But, you see, to promote treaty negotiations, I must silence the naysayers at home. They constantly complain about policies harming France's interests. So, I propose a different approach, such as temporarily raising France's industrial product tariffs to 25%, then lowering them each year, reaching 5% in 7 years. They would see short-term gains and become less resistant. The current Treaty of Eden set French industrial product tariffs between 12% and 15%. This plan reduced them to the current level in just 3 years. Chapter 77 Attack. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hartley did some quick mental math. At this rate, France's tariffs would plummet below 10% within 5 years. French industry wouldn't stand a chance. When those tariffs hit 5%, France would become a dumping ground, practically a British colony. He swallowed his excitement, clasped his trembling hands behind his back, and said, I'll pass this on to Parliament. Personally, though, I find your suggestions intriguing. Joseph felt a wave of relief. If they stuck with the current tariff levels, British goods would crush French industry in no time. The 25% tariff would give French workshops some breathing room. Once he built a solid political base, he could kickstart France's industrial revolution. He had the tech and ideas of the future. If it took him 7 years to make French industry better than Britain's, he might as well pack it in. When France had its own supercharged industrial revolution, they'd be the ones dumping goods on Britain, with its rock-bottom tariffs. Now that he'd played the industry card, it was time to collect some interest. Mr. Ambassador, France is making major concessions on industrial tariffs. Shouldn't the UK reciprocate on agricultural products? Hartley nodded instantly. Absolutely. There's always room for negotiation on wine tariffs. In the last trade talks, the French were obsessed with wine exports, practically trading their entire industrial market for access to the British wine market. Joseph smiled. Actually, besides wine, we also have a few breweries in Normandy, and some distilleries, I believe. It would be ideal if the tariffs on those could also be lowered to under 10%. Oh, and luxury goods, of course. You might have heard I have some interests in that sector. Any help you could offer would be greatly appreciated. Hartley paused, considering. I'll certainly relay your requests to Parliament. French beer was nothing special, and their spirits weren't exactly flying off the shelves. Opening the British market to them was no big deal. Luxury goods were a niche market anyway. Compared to the massive profits from industrial products, these were peanuts. I'm glad we're on the same page, Joseph said. We should both push to restart trade negotiations as soon as possible. Hartley had another question. Your Highness, are these just your personal ideas, or do they reflect? Just my personal thoughts. However, I'm confident these will be the terms proposed by the French negotiating team. Hartley nodded, raised his wine glass in a toast. To thriving Anglo-French trade, he thought, it's unlikely the Crown Prince's influence alone will be enough to dictate the negotiations. I'll suggest Parliament use its resources in France to help him get his way, even if they couldn't wrap up negotiations quickly, as long as the French Crown Prince was on board, a new treaty was inevitable. Joseph raised his glass and clinked it against Hartley's, just as an actor on stage bellowed, 30 years on the east bank of the Seine, 30 years on the west. Don't underestimate a poor man's ambition. That the impassioned words brought the audience to their feet, applauding wildly, some even moved to tears. I won't keep you from enjoying the performance, Hartley said, bowing as he turned to leave. He was already calculating how, if the French Crown Prince's proposed negotiation terms held, he might just be able to make a play for Prime Minister. As for his original mission, promoting the shipbuilding treaty, he'd completely forgotten about it. The next day, the East Palace at Versailles was hosting the first cabinet meeting since the High Court had rejected the tax bill. Joseph entered the Grand Hall, tucking away the several pages of reports he held. It was the investigation report from Fouché. They had found the mistress of the former police chief, Guizot, a woman named Anna. With Guizot's arrest, Anna had fallen on hard times. Finally, seduced by a spy from the police intelligence service, she revealed that Guizot and Similayan had discussed how to stir up trouble in the Saint-Antoine district to make the Dauphin look bad. More importantly, in their conversation, Guizot and Similayan mentioned that if anything went wrong, a big shot would take care of it. Anna had visited Guizot in prison, and he told her to contact Louis, the Paris municipal commissioner, saying he would try to help her. While there was no hard evidence, it was almost certain that Louis was the one protecting Guizot. Louis belonged to the political camp of the Duke of Orleans. Since he himself had no conflict with Joseph, the mastermind had to be the Duke of Orleans. Additionally, Fouché had discovered that before Joseph became assistant to the Minister of Finance, the Duke of Orleans had attended a banking guild cocktail party and publicly urged banks to delay the government's 6 million livre loan as long as possible. The news had spread easily, as many people had attended the reception. Therefore, the Duke of Orleans was behind everything. Joseph's eyes turned cold. He needed to find a way to eliminate this threat, or he might be in trouble later. Soon, Queen Mary entered the meeting hall. Everyone bowed respectfully as the cabinet meeting officially began. As Chief Minister, Briand was about to summarize the important events of the past few days, when he saw Justice Minister Sumiel and the Duke of Orleans exchange a glance. Sumiel then stood up and declared loudly, Archbishop Briand, the most critical matter for France right now is to advance the tax bill. I'm sure everyone is eager to hear about the progress you've made. Briand's face darkened. It was common knowledge that the High Court had rejected the bill, and the Minister of Justice was deliberately provoking him. Suppressing his anger, he said in a low voice, the High Court has refused to register the bill. However, I have adjusted the terms and will resubmit it. Sumiel smirked. The bill you submitted last time was an attack on the nobility, which is why it was rejected. How will you adjust it this time? Will you target the military, or perhaps the royal family itself? Sumiel continued, as far as I know, the High Court has reached a consensus and will refuse to cooperate with you. In other words, any bills you submit will certainly be rejected. He looked at Queen Mary and raised his voice. Your Majesty, I believe that for the sake of France's financial stability, the candidate for finance minister must be replaced to ensure that the tax bill can be passed as soon as possible. Before the Queen could respond, Foreign Minister Verzin stood up and stroked his chest. I agree with Count Sumiel's suggestion. The national finances are on the verge of collapse, and Archbishop Burien should be held responsible. Thank you to White Knight Returns to Dust and Be Mountain for their generous rewards for this book. Your support is the motivation for me to code. The young author would like to express my gratitude. Chapter 78 Attack and Defense Battle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sumiel bowed to the Queen and announced, Your Majesty, also recommending the resignation of Archbishop Briand are the Duke of Seville, the Count of Serrurier, the Marquis of Saint-Villon. He rattled off about a dozen names, all highly influential nobles. Vilson glanced at Brian. All anyone is talking about in Paris is Archbishop Briand's lack of financial savvy and his outdated approach to money matters. Queen Mary, surprised by the widespread opposition, said hesitantly, the tax bill is complex. Perhaps Archbishop Briand needs more time. The Duke of Orleans, who had been plotting to oust Briand for ages, wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. He coughed politely, then rose. Your Majesty, I have some contacts in the banking industry who've informed me that a while back, the Assistant Finance Minister inexplicably cut off loan cooperation with two banks, causing them significant losses. This has created a storm of discontent with the state's fiscal policy throughout the banking world. To undermine Brian, he conveniently blamed Joseph's actions on him. It was a plausible move, since Brian was ultimately responsible for all financial matters. Sumiel feigned shock, adding, that sounds serious. Indeed, the Duke of Orleans replied with false concern. A friend confided that the Banking Association may boycott Archbishop Briand, which would seriously hamper the government's ability to secure loans. He turned to Queen Mary. As you know, Your Majesty, without bank loans, we can't service the national debt. We'd be in default. He was exaggerating, of course. For banks, lending to the government was a sweet deal, high interest rates with virtually no risk of default. Losing government loan business hit Mtlnovel and Laborde hard, leaving them desperate, visibly worried. Queen Mary frowned and asked, what can be done? Is there any way to salvage this? Perhaps. The Duke of Orleans paused dramatically. There is someone who could handle this situation. Who? The Queen asked anxiously. Someone you know well, Mr. Necker, the Duke replied. He has a long-standing rapport with the banking industry and a wealth of financial experience. I believe he's the ideal candidate for finance minister right now. Verzin and Sumiel quickly chimed in, Mr. Necker is definitely capable of solving these problems. I agree. He's the only one for the job. Queen Mary watched the three men, seemingly so concerned about the country's welfare, and sighed inwardly. To be honest, she wasn't thrilled with Brian's performance as finance minister. The national debt hadn't budged, and the tax bill was still stalled after more than 6 months. Plus, he'd managed to alienate the banking industry. She'd initially appointed Brian to the position because he was the Speaker of the Assembly of Notables, representing the powerful nobles. Appeasing him would help gain their support for the new tax bill, but the moment Brian sided with the Crown, the Assembly of Notables abandoned him. Politically speaking, he was now essentially useless. If replacing him could advance the tax bill and win over the banks, it was worth considering. Besides, Necker had served as finance minister before. Although he'd been dismissed for disclosing the royal family's spending, he was undeniably skilled in financial matters. The Queen raised her eyes and addressed the other ministers. And what are your opinions on this matter? Joseph had been caught off guard by the sudden attack from the Minister of Justice and the Duke of Orleans. Now, he realized they were angling to get rid of Brian and install Necker. Historically, Necker did replace Brian as finance minister, just a few months later. Appointing him would be the final nail in the coffin for Louis XVI's hopes of saving himself. Necker represented the interests of capitalists, specifically, bank capital. How could he be expected to serve the royal family sincerely? During his tenure, the French government's borrowing from banks had skyrocketed, even when Carlin, the subsequent finance minister, tried to avoid high-interest loans. France had become addicted to debt and couldn't turn back. Moreover, Necker's publicizing of the royal family's expenditures had fueled criticism of their lavish spending. In reality, much of that spending was the government buying back fiefdoms from the nobles. The king's personal expenses primarily came from his own estates and properties, and he frequently dipped into his personal fortune to cover the national deficit. Joseph narrowed his eyes. He wouldn't let the Duke of Orleans win this one. His plan to push through the tax bill was just gaining momentum, and he needed Brian's cooperation. He had to protect him now, and thwart Necker's ascent. He stood up and declared, "Actually, Archbishop Brian has made significant progress on the tax bill. If you go to Paris, you'll see that most people believe nobles should pay land tax, and they strongly support the new bill." It was an exaggeration, but similar opinions were beginning to surface. Sumiel countered, "Your Highness, from what I hear, many people still doubt the bill." Joseph smiled dismissively. "But those doubts are fading." As circulation of his two newspapers grew, public opinion was sure to swing in favor of the bill. After all, it barely affected most people and would improve government finances. There was no reason for them not to support it. "No, Your Highness, the tax bill has faced opposition for too long. People will never." Joseph didn't want to get bogged down in these details. The others were clearly well prepared. Getting drawn into a detailed debate would play into their hands. He raised his hand to cut him off. "Your Majesty, Archbishop Brian has developed a complete plan to promote the tax bill and is already implementing it. In fact, I can confidently say that the tax bill will be registered in the High Court within 2 months at the latest." Everyone was stunned. They hadn't expected Brian to be so confident. Brian was also confused. He had no idea about this plan. But he immediately understood that the Crown Prince was covering for him. Chapter 79 Declaration of War. You are listening at novelfull.audio. De Sumiel and Verzin exchanged a quick glance at the Duke of Orleans, thrown off balance by this unexpected turn. They had a plan, but not for this. Normally, Brian would have two choices when ambushed like this: first, cave and announce his resignation; second, try to deflect blame and stall for time, hoping to rally support after the meeting. They were ready to mobilize nobles and the banks to pressure the Queen, ensuring Brian's dismissal, but Brian was fighting back, right there and then. The Duke of Orleans frowned. "Archbishop Brian," he said coldly, "you've been completely ineffective in getting this tax bill through. Where does this sudden confidence come from? France is in dire financial straits. If you fail again in 2 months." Brian risked a glance at Joseph, who gave a subtle nod. Reassured, Brian boomed, "Duke Orleans, how do you know my previous attempts weren't tests for the High Court? The bill's rejection was part of my larger strategy." A political veteran, Brian could spin truth and lies in the same breath. He turned to Queen Mary, his voice resolute. "Your Majesty, if the tax bill isn't registered in 2 months, I offer myself for exile to Corsica. France often exiled disgraced officials, but usually to places like Lorraine or Perpignan. Sending someone to an island was serious punishment. Brian had expected to be dismissed eventually and was prepared to accept it. But something told him the Crown Prince might actually get the bill passed. Not willing to let his career end, he decided to gamble on the prince. Seeing the Queen's hesitation, the Duke of Orleans pressed his advantage. "There's no need to waste 2 more months. We should have Mr. Necker fix France's finances now." Joseph smiled calmly. "Duke of Orleans, is Mr. Necker confident he can get the tax bill passed in 2 months?" The Duke hesitated. He was one of the main roadblocks to the bill's passage. "Probably not," he admitted. Joseph turned to the Queen. "Your Majesty, if Mr. Necker can't do it, why not give the confident Archbishop Brian a chance?" Orleans was getting desperate. "Your Majesty, Archbishop Brian will only make things worse," Joseph countered. "Only passing the tax bill can improve things, and Mr. Necker can't do that." Joseph knew that taxing the nobles more wouldn't solve France's financial problems. But this bill was a crucial symbolic battle between royal power and the aristocracy. The loser would suffer a major political blow. The bill had to pass. The queen rubbed her temples, overwhelmed by the back and forth. These weighty matters of state were too much for her. Her gaze shifted between Joseph and the Duke of Orleans. Joseph made sense, but Orleans was an experienced minister whose opinions carried weight. Then she considered Brian's confidence. Did he really have a chance? But what about the nobles and the banks? Her mind was a battlefield of conflicting opinions. Finally, Queen Mary looked to the other ministers for help. What are your thoughts on this? That the neutral ministers didn't want to choose sides. They kept their heads down, silent. Home Secretary Mtlnovel started to speak, then stopped. Seeing their silence, the Queen looked back at the Duke of Orleans and Brian. Finally, she placed her hands weakly on the table and said softly, Archbishop Brian will remain in charge of financial affairs. I urge you all to make a fair judgment based on the best interests of France in 2 months. I'm adjourning the meeting. We'll continue tomorrow to make a decision. Decision meant a collective vote by the ministers on the issue. She signaled the end of the meeting, and with the maid's help, walked towards the golden door. Joseph frowned. The Queen lacked decisiveness and courage, leaving the problem to her ministers. The Duke of Orleans gave Brian a smug look and left with his supporters. War had been declared. There was little room for compromise. Now, each side would use any means necessary. Joseph and Brian went to the Chancellor's office. After closing the door, Brian leaned in. Thank you for your help, Your Highness. You saved me and France's finances. He asked, tell me the truth. Are you sure the bill will pass? Joseph knew their fates were linked. Rest assured, he said, nodding. I am certain. The Assembly of Notables seems like an unbeatable political monster, but it has 2 weaknesses. First, it's not united. It's divided between the old aristocracy and the new rich. We can exploit that divide. Second, it relies too much on the High Court. Without their support, they're just nobles without real power. And the High Court is corrupt and vulnerable to attack. Brian nodded thoughtfully. Your analysis is thorough, but we only have 2 months. Joseph smiled. Don't worry. I have the means to divide the assembly, and I have the public opinion tools to force the High Court to surrender. With your political capital, I can get the bill passed in less than 2 months. Brian's eyes lit up. He was finally convinced he'd made the right bet. As they spoke, Iman announced, Your Highness, Count Mtlnovel is here. Brian and Joseph exchanged a look. Send him in. The doors unlocked. Home Secretary Mtlnovel entered, looking serious. Chapter 80 Political Dealing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Mtlnovel bowed to Joseph and Brian, his voice serious. This cabinet decision will shape our financial future. Everyone's understandably cautious. Brian chuckled, Count Mtlnovel, I hear your son will be 15 soon, and quite the bright young man. He extended a hand towards Mtlnovel. Forgive my presumption, but he seems like a worthy heir. Mtlnovel's eyes lit up. You mean, you can help him? He was over 60. His wife and only legitimate son had both died. While he had several illegitimate children, French law barred them from inheriting. Brian nodded. It'll be a process, but I believe there are ways. I can promise you that. Mtlnovel gripped his hand, excited. Archbishop Brian, you've always been my most respected advisor. That will never change. He already had a connection with Brian, and a budding one with Joseph. With the crown prince now firmly in Brian's corner, Mtlnovel had made his choice. But he still expected a reward for his loyalty. Brian was happy to provide it. Securing inheritance rights for an illegitimate son wasn't easy. Only Brian's church connections and his position as chief minister made it remotely possible. Mtlnovel was taking a political risk, of course. But he'd calculated that even if Brian lost, he'd still gain favor with the crown prince, minimizing the damage. Brian quickly responded, "Thank you for your trust, Count Mono. My friendship is yours." With their interests aligned, Mono immediately began brainstorming. "Archbishop Brian, are you confident about tomorrow's vote?" Brian admitted, "Right now, only you and the prince are guaranteed to support me." Mono pondered. "Traditionally, the military stays out of these things. And the Duke of Orleans has the Minister of Justice and the Foreign Minister on his side, making it 3. Brian finished. Count Nicoet's vote becomes crucial. Nicoet, the Minister of Household Registration, was usually the least influential cabinet member. Now, he was at the center of the storm. Mono lowered his head, analyzing. "The Duke of Orleans is probably trying to woo him as we speak." Joseph looked at him. "What kind of offer do you think the Duke's making?" Mono thought for a moment. "Money, a lot of it. Or maybe a manor. You know the Duke, he's loaded." Joseph pressed. "Tell me about Count Nicoet." "Well, he was once an advisor to the king, and later became Minister of Household Registration thanks to Viscount Carlona. He hasn't exactly set the world on fire. People call him Invisible Nicoet behind his back." Joseph smiled. "I think I'll go have a chat with him." As dusk settled, Nicoet walked respectfully beside the Dauphin along the stone path bordering the palace of Versailles Square. He knew his position and was waiting for offers from both sides. He'd expected Brian to approach him, but instead, it was the crown prince. "Trade negotiations?" Nicoet looked surprised. "Your Highness, are you asking me to lead the trade negotiations?" Joseph nodded. "Yes, we'll be reopening negotiations on the Treaty of Eden with Britain soon." Nicoet frowned. "But, what does this have to do with me?" "Usually, the Foreign Secretary and the Finance Minister handle these things." Joseph smiled. "Not necessarily. The Finance Minister sets the terms, but someone needs to coordinate and communicate with the British. After today's cabinet meeting, it's clear Versailles and Archbishop Brian can no longer cooperate. The Finance Minister has to be involved, so we need someone else to work with Brian." "Someone like you." Nicoet was immediately intrigued. Leading negotiations with the British offered political capital he couldn't gain from a lifetime of census-taking. Count Vergennes' greatest achievement had been forging the Franco-American alliance, followed by the Treaty of Eden. Could I achieve the same kind of recognition as Vergennes? The thought startled him. "But, Your Highness, I have no experience in this area." Joseph waved his concern away. "That's easy. You just need to uphold France's dignity with the British. I know you have the ability, you just haven't had the opportunity to show it. If you display your diplomatic talents during these negotiations, you might even have a shot at becoming Foreign Secretary." Nicoet's breathing quickened. It wasn't just the Foreign Secretary's power, but the fact that he was tired of the household registration, no recognition, the same documents and data, and a reputation for being transparent. But the Foreign Secretary had the whole world as his stage, dancing freely between nations. He looked at Joseph, serious. "Your Highness, are you sure these trade negotiations will be reopened?" "Positive. You can ask the British ambassador to France yourself. And Archbishop Brian will lead the negotiations with me, that's what the Archbishop wants." Joseph kept smiling. When Mono mentioned Nicoet's wealth, his lack of influence, and his dissatisfaction, Joseph knew what to offer. Sure enough, Nicoet stopped, turned, and declared, "Your Highness, you have the vote you expected." Joseph nodded, satisfied, and added, "Count Nicoet, one last thing. If Archbishop Brier resigns as Finance Minister, then Necker and Vilsen will lead the trade negotiations." Nicoet replied firmly, "Yes, Your Highness. I won't let that happen." Compared to the Foreign Minister's position, the Duke of Orleans's promised hundreds of thousands of livres paled in comparison. Joseph said goodbye to Nicoet and walked back towards the Palace of Versailles, thinking, politics is like haggling in a market. Someone makes an offer, someone counters, and the highest bidder wins. Some know the buyer's motivations and can demand a premium, or, if you're strong enough, you just force the deal, but at the end of the day, it's always a transaction.